Chandler Helderson. On July 1, 2021, in Windsor, Wisconsin, Chandler Halderson shot his father in the back inside their family basement. Bart Halderson was 50 years old, a dedicated father who worked hard for his family. When 53-year-old Krista Halderson walked through the door later that day, Chandler took her life too. What happened over the following days would expose a deeply disturbed young man. His entire adult life was built on a mountain of lies he would kill to protect. He had spun a massive web of deception, telling his parents he was attending Madison College when he had actually failed out. He even claimed to have landed a high-paying job at SpaceX, forging school emails to keep the massive lie alive. For months, his unsuspecting parents truly believed their son was headed for greatness. But just days before the tragedy, the illusion started to fall apart. Bart confronted Chandler about major red flags on his college transcripts. The parents demanded answers that their son simply could not give without exposing his fake life. Prosecutors argued he desperately feared losing his family support and his fake reputation. After taking his parents' lives, Chandler went on to dismember their bodies. He then hid the remains across several locations in southern Wisconsin. Investigators eventually located Bart's torso hidden inside an oil drum on a local farm. Krista's legs were recovered from the Wisconsin River. Police found a saw, scissors, and bolt cutters used in the crime. On July 7th, Chandler calmly reported his parents missing to the police. He claimed they had gone up to the family cabin in Langlade County and never came back. He even blamed their sudden disappearance on unusual gambling trips, but detectives immediately noticed holes in his story. The big break came from Snapchat location tracking. The app's map feature placed Chandler at the precise spots where the victim's remains were hidden. His girlfriend, Catherine Melander, cooperated fully by sharing cell phone data and was cleared of any crime. The trial began in January 2022. Prosecutors laid out the damning digital footprint alongside gruesome forensic evidence from the scene. His defense team argued that while he was a pathological liar, that did not prove he was a killer. They painted him as an insecure storyteller, completely incapable of committing such a horrific, violent act. After examining the facts, the jury disagreed. Chandler was found guilty on 2 counts of first-degree intentional homicide, along with charges of body mutilation and lying to police. In March 2022, the judge handed down a life sentence with no chance of parole. At his sentencing, Chandler made a statement, saying he would trade his life for theirs. Whether that was actual remorse or just another act remained highly debated by everyone in the courtroom. Krista's cousin, Barbie Townsend, spoke about the family's absolute devastation, explaining that the parents would have done absolutely anything to help their struggling son. They would have given up everything for him. Instead, their unconditional love and support ended up costing them their lives. In 2023, 2 minor convictions for hiding bodies were dismissed on technicalities, but his life sentence stood firm. In November 2025, a state appeals court upheld his murder conviction. He will stay behind bars for the rest of his life. A BC's 2020 covered the tragedy in May 2025, shining a harsh light on the lies that had long defined Chandler's relationship with his parents. Bart and Krista Halderson worked tirelessly to give their sons a good life, never dreaming their generosity would be met with such brutal betrayal. Mitchell Halderson, Chandler's older brother, did not just lose his parents, he essentially lost his brother too. A family that once celebrated holidays and milestones together was shattered, all because one son refused to face the truth of his own failures. The next tragic case involves a brief confrontation that lasted minutes but claimed 2 lives. Daniel Diane. On September 30th, 2009, in South Kewton, London, 35-year-old Daniel Dighton attacked his parents inside their own home. His 61-year-old father, Barry, was a retired headmaster who had spent his life working in education. His mother, Elizabeth, was 60, a fellow teacher who shared that same passion for helping young students. They were packing for a vacation in France when a dispute with their son turned deadly. Daniel was jobless and bunking with his parents. Everyone saw him as a freeloading layabout who refused to pitch in, relying entirely on his mother and father to survive. He spent his days weaving lies about his life, dodging any form of real work or adult responsibility. On September 30th, Daniel was still highly hungover from drinking the night before. His parents finally confronted him about his lazy lifestyle and lack of life direction. They had bankrolled him for years without getting a single penny back, and their patience had finally run dry. Within minutes, the tense exchange boiled over from simple criticism into a blinding, violent rage. Barry and Elizabeth only wanted to help, but their concern triggered a dark switch in Daniel. He grabbed a knife and lunged at his father first. Barry was stabbed 4 times, but Elizabeth suffered a far more brutal attack, receiving 28 wounds. It was a prolonged, blood-soaked frenzy. The sheer number of injuries showed an absolute explosion of uncontrolled rage. Panicked neighbors heard blood-curdling screams from the house and immediately dialed for emergency services. When officers finally breached the house, Daniel had already hidden away inside the attic. Officers quickly found him and put him in cuffs, right there in the home where his parents lay dead. As she was being attacked, Elizabeth begged her son, saying, "What are you doing, Danny? I love you." Those heartbreaking words were some of her last, spoken to the boy who was actively ending her life. Her desperate final words were later presented during the trial. The entire trial centered around Daniel's mental state on that terrible morning. Psychiatrists pointed to schizoid personality traits and sudden, overwhelming stress as factors that triggered his explosive outburst. Prosecutors pushed hard for double murder, but the jury ultimately agreed with the defense's claim of diminished responsibility. Instead of murder, Daniel was convicted of manslaughter, receiving an indefinite prison sentence with a 15-year minimum. His prison sentence was later shortened on appeal. Though he cut his parents' lives short, Daniel was still poised to benefit from their deaths. Being their sole surviving child, Daniel walked away with around £1.5 million from their estate. Strangely, the law in England and Wales doesn't automatically bar a manslaughter convict from inheriting their victim's money, especially when a court finds diminished responsibility. Daniel Dighton was released from prison in 2024. After completing his minimum term, he was approved for parole. Today, he's totally free to spend the massive fortune left behind by the parents he murdered. Barry and Elizabeth had devoted their entire lives to teaching, spending decades guiding young minds toward a better future. They only wanted their troubled son to find his own path, hoping a little more patience and love would save him. Instead, their dying moments were filled with the horror of his betrayal. This case exposes some incredibly disturbing loopholes in our legal system. Normally, a murder conviction instantly strips a killer's right to inherit, but a manslaughter ruling creates massive gray areas, leaving Daniel free to pocket his family's millions. What happens when a family dispute ends with a call from a church? Meet Trevor Lee. On August 4, 2025, in Midburgh, Florida, Trevor Lee shot his parents, David Lee and Brandy Smith, inside their own home. David was 44 and Brandy was 45. They were proud military veterans who had built a peaceful, loving home. Even today, the exact timeline of that bloody morning remains deeply mysterious. Police reports suggest a massive family fight broke out beforehand, but the exact details have never been shared with the public. Trevor didn't have a single black mark on his record, leaving friends and family completely paralyzed by shock. His closest friend, who had been by his side since childhood, called him a kind, caring person. He added that David and Brandy had treated him like their own child throughout all those years. The friend firmly believed this horror was just one catastrophic choice, not a reflection of who Trevor truly was. After the shooting, Trevor walked over to Point Church nearby. From there, he made a 22-minute call to 911, speaking in a calm voice. He confessed to what he had done and made a single request: "I need to pray." Those were his exact words to emergency dispatchers. He waited at the church for deputies to arrive, surrendering peacefully when they showed up. Forensics later confirmed that both victims had suffered multiple gunshot wounds. Investigators focused on piecing together a timeline to determine what triggered the fatal domestic argument. Police records showed previous emergency calls to the residence, including a domestic incident back in 2022. The state indicted Trevor as an adult on 2 counts of first-degree murder. Charging him as an adult reflected the extreme severity of the crime under Florida state law. On August 19th, he stood before a judge and entered a plea of not guilty, with his trial set for February 2026. Until then, Trevor stays behind bars, waiting for the legal process that will decide his future. the local community is still struggling to process the sudden loss of two individuals who, by all accounts, were devoted parents. David and Brandy Lee both served in the military before settling in Midburg. Neighbors described the home they built for their son as a stable and supportive environment. Friends still find it almost impossible to reconcile the family they knew with the violence of August 4th. The tragedy raises troubling questions about what could drive a teen without warning signs to do something so extreme. While the legal process slowly unfolds, detectives are still working hard to piece together exactly what happened inside the home that morning. Our next case centers on a party that no guest would ever forget, hosted by Tyler Hadley. On July 16, 2011, in Port St. Lucie, Florida, Tyler Hadley used a heavy hammer to take the lives of his parents inside their family home. Blake was 54 years old, a father who had spent years trying to help his troubled teenager. Mary Jo was 47. After hiding his actions, Tyler invited about 60 people over for a gathering that would become one of the most disturbing house parties in history. Tyler had grown deeply bitter about his parents trying to control him and stop his drug habits. He was regularly taking ecstasy and other substances, which he later admitted caused him to lose touch with reality entirely. His twisted jokes about hurting his parents eventually evolved into a dark, genuine obsession. During a 2024 interview, Tyler admitted the murderous plan began as a passing thought he simply could not escape. He spoke of falling into a psychotic trance, driven by a desperate desire to end his internal pain. That dark fantasy soon turned into a brutal reality one afternoon when he finally snapped. Tyler attacked both parents with a hammer in the master bedroom, locked the door to hide them, and immediately began inviting friends over online. Within hours, dozens of teenagers packed into the Hadley residence, completely unaware of the horror locked away just feet from them. Amidst the chaos, Tyler confessed to a close friend. He allegedly boasted about the crime, bragging that hosting a wild party after doing something so extreme was totally unprecedented. At first, the friend refused to believe the story, but curiosity drove him to peek behind that locked bedroom door. Horrified, the teen called the police, who arrived to find the bodies. Deputies arrested Tyler right there at his own house, surrounded by oblivious partygoers who had no clue they were celebrating just inches from a gruesome double homicide. Forensic teams quickly recovered the murder weapon, a bloody hammer that still carried clear evidence of the violence. The lack of any defensive wounds suggested both parents were caught completely by surprise. The quiet, bloody scene inside that locked bedroom stood in terrifying contrast to the loud party raging right outside. Over the next few years, the legal system slowly processed his horrific crimes. Tyler pleaded no contest to first-degree murder and received a life sentence without the possibility of parole in 2014. However, landmark changes in Florida laws concerning underage offenders later triggered a mandatory resentencing hearing. He was ultimately resentenced in 2018, making him eligible for a formal parole review in 2039. Today, he remains locked up in a Florida prison, having spent every single day of his adulthood behind bars for what he did at 17. In his 2024 interview, Tyler spoke openly about the terrifying rage that drove him and the heavy regret he now carries. He described a massive disconnect between the person he was back then and the man he claims to have become during his long years behind bars. Whether that change is real is up to the parole board to decide. The people at the party that night have carried their own heavy burdens. Most of them had no idea what was hidden in the adjacent room while they talked and laughed. The deep trauma of that discovery haunted many of them for decades. The next case involves horrific claims of demonic forces and would end with an execution. Sean Sellers. On March 5, 1986 in Oklahoma City, Sean Sellers shot his mother Vonda and stepfather Paul Beloff as they slept in their bed. Vonda was 32 and Paul was 43. Sean then staged the scene to look like an outside intruder had broken in and done it. But this was not Sean's first time taking a life. 6 months earlier, in September 1985, he had shot and killed a convenience store clerk named Robert Bauer. When later asked why, Sean offered an unsettling explanation. "I wanted to see what it feels like." That was how Sean described his motivation for ending Bauer's life. The clerk had done absolutely nothing to provoke him. Sean simply wanted to experience what it was like to take a life. Sean had gotten deeply involved in Satanism. and even claimed to be in direct communication with a demon he called Ezerate. He also had an intense obsession with Dungeons and Dragons, though how much the game influenced his crimes remained highly debated in court. His defense team tried to portray him as delusional, but the prosecution argued his actions were purely calculated. At first, investigators treated the teenage Sean as a grieving victim. He had successfully set up the house to point to an intruder, but his alibi began to crumble when friends stepped forward with the truth. Sean's close friend, Richard Howard, delivered the testimony that broke the case wide open. Howard revealed Sean's dark obsession with Satanism and his chilling comments about wanting to murder his parents. Detectives immediately re-examined the home with fresh eyes, leading straight to Sean's arrest. The upcoming trial would link Sean to both the Bauer homicide and his parents' murders. Despite intense debates over his mental health and dark beliefs, the jury found him guilty on 3 counts of first-degree murder. The sentence was death. Sean Sears was executed by lethal injection on February 4, 1999. He became the first person executed in the United States for crimes committed at 16 since capital punishment was reinstated. His fate fueled the ongoing national debate over juvenile sentencing. During the long years spent on death row, Sean claimed he had converted to Christianity, completely renouncing his past. He expressed deep remorse and documented his transformation in letters from his cell. Whether his change of heart was real remained a source of intense debate for everyone watching. His upcoming execution drew heavy criticism from anti-death penalty advocates, who argued that executing a person for crimes committed at 16 was fundamentally cruel, no matter what. It triggered a national conversation about juvenile justice that still echoes in courts today. The grieving families of Robert, Vonda, and Paul all had to live with the knowledge that Sean's dark curiosity had stolen their loved ones forever. 3 innocent lives were taken just so a teenager could satisfy a morbid urge he blamed on demons. The next case follows another young man whose silent, internal battle would explode into horrific tragedy. Kip Kinkle. On May 20, 1998, in Springfield, Oregon, Kip Kinkle shot and killed his parents, Bill and Faith, inside their family home. Bill was a dedicated teacher, and Faith was a retired Spanish educator who loved her students. The next morning, Kip walked into Thurston High School and opened fire, killing 2 students and injuring 25 others before classmates subdued him. He had been silently battling what doctors would later diagnose as paranoid schizophrenia. Dark voices inside his head commanded him to commit violence. The condition went completely undiagnosed during his teenage years, leaving him completely without the support that could have altered his tragic path. The day before the horror began, Kip was expelled for bringing a gun to school. His father, Bill, retrieved him from custody, but the expulsion was a breaking point Kip simply could not handle. That very evening, he turned a rifle on his own parents. He shot Bill Kinkle first. When Faith returned home, she met the same tragic fate. Kip then spent the night alone with their bodies, all while the voices in his head kept screaming commands. By morning, he resolved to finish what he started. When he arrived at Thurston High School, absolute chaos erupted. Kip entered the cafeteria and began shooting. Terrified teenagers scattered, fleeing the gunfire as bullets flew. 2 young students, Ben Walker and Mikkel Nicholson, lost their lives. 25 others were injured before brave classmates tackled and restrained Kip. Kip later described his fractured mental state, chillingly claiming that the voices had made him do it. His confession laid bare the constant demands he heard and his utter inability to resist them. Psychiatric evaluations later confirmed that severe mental illness had directly driven his actions. Despite his diagnosed condition, the court was unyielding. Kip pleaded guilty and received a sentence of 111 years without parole. While the judge acknowledged his mental illness, he heavily emphasized the devastating impact of his crimes. In recent years, Kip has spoken publicly about his case for the very first time, expressing intense remorse and shame. Now, his sister Kristen has become a strong advocate for his release, arguing that decades of rehabilitation have transformed him, making further prison time pointless. With petitions for review still active, Kip Kinkle remains behind bars in an Oregon prison, having now spent over half his life locked up for the horrific acts he committed when the voices grew too loud. Today, his case serves as a dark warning about the desperate need for early mental health intervention. If Kip's severe schizophrenia had been caught and treated earlier, so many lives could have been saved. His parents, Bill and Faith, might still be alive, while Ben Walker and Michael Nicholson could have grown into adulthood. The 25 wounded survivors still carry deep physical and emotional scars from that terrible day. Several have shared their trauma publicly, divided on whether their attacker ever deserves to walk free. The entire survivor community remains deeply split. Kristen Kinkle continues to humanize her brother, though she never downplays the gravity of his crimes. She maintains that the disturbed teenager who pulled the trigger no longer exists, replaced now by a medicated, remorseful man who poses no danger. The justice system continues to weigh these arguments against the innocent lives cut short. If you love deep dives into these chilling, true crime cases, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications now. Our next case inspired books, blockbuster films, and endless debates about the horror inside a house in Amityville. Ronald DeFeo Jr. On November 13, 1974, Ronald DeFeo Jr. walked into Henry's bar in Amityville, New York, announcing that something terrible had happened to his family. He frantically told patrons that his parents had been shot. What he omitted was that he already knew exactly what happened inside that house at 112 Ocean Avenue because he was the one responsible. When police rushed to the DeFeo residence, they discovered 6 bodies. Ronald DeFeo Sr., age 43, and his wife Louise, 42, lay executed in their bed. Their children, Dawn, Allison, Mark, and John, were also shot. The young victims ranged from 9 to 18 years old. Each had been shot with a high-powered rifle while they slept. Ronald Jr. was only 23 at the time. At first, he blamed a mob hitman, claiming his father had dangerous ties to organized crime families. But his elaborate story quickly fell apart under police interrogation. Within 24 hours, Ronald confessed to executing all 6 family members, though his true motive remains a mystery to this day. Ronald spun many different stories over the years. He blamed drugs, claimed demonic voices ordered the killings, and described a violent relationship with his father. But detectives suspected a simpler motive: greed over inheritance money. Ronald's story kept shifting right until the end. Forensic evidence at the crime scene left questions unanswered for decades. All 6 victims were found face down in their beds, showing no signs of a struggle. Nobody in the neighborhood heard the shots, even though the rifle had no silencer. How a single shooter moved room to room, executing 6 people without anyone waking or running, has never been explained. The trial began in 1975. Ronald's lawyers pushed for an insanity plea, claiming severe mental illness drove him to slaughter his family. But the state argued the systematic, cold execution of his family proved he knew exactly what he was doing. The jury completely rejected his insanity plea. Ronald DeFeo Jr. was convicted on 6 counts of second-degree murder, drawing 6 consecutive terms of 25 years to life. This heavy sentence virtually guaranteed he would draw his last breath behind bars. When investigators asked what was running through his head during the murders, he said, "Once I started, I just couldn't stop." A chilling confession, but it still shed no light on why he slaughtered his own family that night. The tragic DeFeo home soon became famous as the Amityville Horror House, inspiring a hit franchise of books and movies based on claims the property was haunted. Sensationalized ghost stories quickly overshadowed the actual tragedy. 6 innocent lives stolen in cold blood by the very person who should have protected them. Ronald DeFeo Jr. died in prison on March 12, 2021, at age 69, after 46 years behind bars. He never gave a straight answer as to why he executed his family back in November 1974. During his decades in prison, he constantly flipped his story. He blamed mob hitmen, claimed his sister Dawn helped with the murders, and even blamed dark supernatural forces. There was zero proof for any of this, with every lie meant to dodge his own guilt. Today, 112 Ocean Avenue stands as a grim landmark of true crime. Millions recognize the address, yet they rarely know the names of the 6 people slaughtered inside: Ronald Sr., Louise, Dawn, Allison, Mark, and John. 6 family members who died because one of their own chose to end them. Let's turn now to a quiet farm in Essex, where a family was destroyed, and doubts about the real killer linger today. Jeremy Bamber. On August 7, 1985, police received a distress call from White House Farm in Essex. The caller was 24-year-old Jeremy Bamber, the adopted son of the family living there. He told police his father, Neville, had phoned in a panic, warning him that his sister, Sheila, had gone crazy with a rifle before the line cut out. When officers broke in, they found 5 bodies. Neville, age 61, and his wife, June, also 61, had both been shot to death. Their 28-year-old adopted daughter, Sheila Caffell, was dead, alongside her young twin sons, Daniel and Nicholas. The victims suffered 25 gunshot wounds in total, mostly at close range. At first, the scene matched Jeremy's story. Sheila lay with a rifle resting on her chest, having suffered 2 gunshot wounds that looked self-inflicted. She had a long, documented history of schizophrenia, so police assumed she killed her family in a psychotic episode before ending her own life. But doubts soon emerged. A gun silencer was found hidden in a cupboard, and the blood on it belonged to Sheila. This changed everything. With that silencer attached, the rifle would have been too long for Sheila to pull the trigger on herself. Then Jeremy's ex-girlfriend, Julie Mugford, went to police with a shocking statement, claiming Jeremy had openly plotted to murder his family for his inheritance. According to Julie, Jeremy openly resented his parents, claiming they had nothing left to live for. Hanging in the balance was a massive inheritance of £436,000. The 1986 trial ended in a conviction by a majority verdict of 10-2. Found guilty on 5 counts of murder, Jeremy received a life sentence with a whole life tariff, ensuring he would never taste freedom again. The verdict followed grueling weeks of testimony painting Jeremy as a cold, calculating monster who wiped out his entire family just to secure their wealth. The sentencing judge described him as warped and evil beyond any human belief. This reflected the court's view that he had meticulously planned and carried out the murders for cash, before trying to frame his mentally ill sister for the horrific crimes. The judge highlighted this chilling deception, pointing out how Jeremy casually waited outside the farmhouse, alongside police officers, while his family lay slaughtered inside. For nearly 40 years, Jeremy has maintained his innocence. His lawyers have launched several appeals, claiming police botched the evidence and planted a silencer. In October 2025, a podcast uncovered a dramatic emergency call from the house. Supporters claim this provides an alibi, since he was standing outside with officers when it happened. But despite this new twist, the Review Commission refused to send the case back to the Court of Appeal. Today, Jeremy Bamber remains locked away in a British prison, maintaining his innocence while serving a sentence that will only end when he dies. To this day, the White House Farm murders remain a highly controversial chapter in British crime history. If he is guilty, he coldly slaughtered 5 family members and pinned it on his sister for weeks before detectives woke up to the truth. But if he is innocent, he has spent 40 years paying the price for someone else's ultimate sin. The absolute truth, however, remains buried with the 5 victims who lost their lives that night in Essex. Our next case follows a desperate son who tried one method, and when that failed, chose another. In March 2012, Stephen Seddon drove his elderly parents to the Bridgewater Canal near Manchester. 68-year-old Robert Seddon trusted his son completely when he got into that car. His mother, Patricia, was 65 years old. Stephen promised them a relaxing family road trip, giving the elderly couple absolutely no reason to suspect a thing. Instead, Stephen purposely plunged the vehicle into the deep canal, leaving his helpless parents strapped in the back. He wanted them to drown while he escaped, framing it as a tragic accident. But his sinister plan fell apart. All 3 were pulled from the water alive, the parents completely oblivious that their own son had just tried to murder them. At 46 years old, Stephen was drowning in massive debts, fueled by his own failed fraudulent schemes. Their estate was valued at £230,000. Stephen saw that money as the quick fix for his debts. When the canal plot failed, he immediately designed a backup plan. On July 4, 2012, Stephen walked into his parents' home in Sale armed with a sawn-off shotgun. Without hesitation, he shot both Robert and Patricia dead inside their own living room. This time, there would be no miraculous rescue and no survivors. Pure greed and crushing debt had driven him to execute his own mother and father. Soon, investigators uncovered the dark link between the canal crash and the shootings. CCTV footage and major lies in his statements quickly pointed detectives directly to him. The canal crash, once dismissed as a fluke accident, was reevaluated as his first murder attempt. The pattern was undeniable. Stephen was determined to get his hands on that inheritance by any means necessary. Stephen was convicted of double murder, alongside 2 counts of attempted murder stemming directly from the canal incident. Prosecutors successfully argued that Crash was a cold, deliberate plot to drown his parents. Handing down a life sentence with a 40-year minimum, the judge told him, "You executed your own parents." The judge condemned the calculated nature of his crimes, noting that when the first method failed, he simply waited and used a shotgun. Today, Stephen Seddon remains behind bars in a British prison with zero hope of release. His parents had spent their entire lives building the wealth he craved, only to die by the hand of the son they raised. In the end, the very inheritance he was willing to kill for was stripped away by his conviction. Robert and Patricia Seddon survived a horrific crash into a canal in March, completely unaware their own son had steered them into the water. They had absolutely no warning when he returned 4 months later with a far more violent plan. Their unconditional love made them entirely blind to the predator hiding right inside their own home. What drives a man to stage a break-in to cover up his own parents' murder? Let's look closer. Martin Ruddy. On December 12, 2014, in Newcastle, Martin Ruddy viciously assaulted his father, Eric, and his stepmother, Carol, inside their house. At 64 years old, Eric Ruddy was a hard-working family man who spent his life providing for his loved ones. Carol Ruddy, 54, had built a warm place in the family after marrying Eric. Neither parent survived the horror of that night. Martin cornered his father and beat him repeatedly with a heavy brick. Then, he strangled his stepmother, Carol, using a television cable. The onslaught was relentless and brutal, leaving both of them dead on the floor. But Martin was far from finished. He still had to explain away the carnage. The 29-year-old former bouncer quickly staged the entire crime scene to make it look like a tragic home invasion. He intentionally cut and bruised himself to look like a victim who survived, and then dialed the police to report that home invaders had attacked his family. The motive boiled down to money. Martin was drowning in debt and stood to inherit £90,000 from his father. Instead of working off his heavy debts honestly, he decided murdering his parents was his quickest way out. But his fake break-in story quickly unraveled. Security cameras in the area showed zero sign of any intruders entering or leaving the house. DNA testing found no trace of outside attackers. Every piece of forensic evidence pointed to one single suspect, Martin himself. Detectives soon realized the entire crime scene had been staged. The cuts Martin gave himself simply did not match a real violent struggle. Instead, the injuries on his parents told a completely different story from his lies. Physical evidence completely shattered his fake robbery narrative. A jury ultimately convicted Martin of 2 counts of murder. They weighed his crushing debts, his greed for the inheritance, and the hard forensics that exposed his lies. His scheme failed entirely. The judge handed Martin 2 life sentences with a minimum of 35 years, calling the murders a sickening breach of trust. Eric and Carol had opened their home to Martin, never dreaming their own son would repay their love with ultimate betrayal. Today, Martin remains locked up in a British prison. The blood money he killed his parents for was completely stripped away from him. Eric and Carol Ruddy should have grown old together in peace, but instead, they were slaughtered by their own flesh and blood. Staging the break-in revealed a cold, calculated planning that went far beyond the murders. Martin did not just plan to kill his parents, he actively plotted how he would cover his tracks. He invented a story, slashed his own skin, and called the police with a web of lies. The cover-up required careful planning that stretched long after the violence ended. Now, we are moving to a case involving a weapon so savage, even the judge could not look at the photos. Christopher Puglia. On May 16, 2020, in a suburb of Brisbane, Australia, Christopher Puglia ambushed his parents, Franco and Loris, inside their home. Both were 59 years old, a devoted couple who had spent decades building their lives and raising their family. Christopher chose a heavy sledgehammer, leaving a scene of devastation that words cannot describe. He mercilessly bludgeoned both his mother and father to death. The assault was savage and prolonged, inflicting catastrophic, fatal injuries on Franco and Loris. Once it was over, Christopher fled into the night, abandoning his parents' bodies inside the home they had built together. At 31 years old, Christopher had been living with them after recently losing his job. To this day, the true motive behind the killings remains a mystery. Detectives uncovered deep family tensions after Christopher moved back home, but nothing that could justify the sheer brutality of his actions. Following the attack, Christopher fled south into New South Wales. Police eventually arrested him near Newcastle, hundreds of kilometers away from the grim crime scene. Running from Queensland proved he knew exactly how severe the consequences of his actions would be. The crime scene photos were so horrifying that even the presiding judge struggled to look at them. The massive pools of blood and horrific injuries left on Franco and Loris Puglia showed just how long and relentless the attack had been. The damage a sledgehammer inflicts on a human body is something even veteran investigators and lawyers struggle to process. Christopher eventually pleaded guilty to 2 counts of murder, saving his family from the trauma of a trial, yet never explaining why he committed such a horrific act. In March 2024, he was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 30 years. At the sentencing, Christopher's brother James stood up, delivering a statement that laid bare the family's utter ruin. "You have officially lost the right to call them your parents." Those words captured the deep sense of betrayal felt by James and his family. Christopher had not only murdered Franco and Loris, but he had shattered his entire family. Today, Christopher Puglia sits in an Australian prison, where he will spend at least the next 30 years. Franco and Lori Puglia had simply opened their home to their struggling son, paying for that final act of kindness with their very lives. The crime shocked the public, not only for its sheer cruelty, but for the weapon chosen. A sledgehammer is meant for construction, not murder. It is a common household tool, likely sitting in their garage for ordinary weekend projects. But Christopher weaponized this everyday object, turning it on the very parents who had sheltered him when he needed it most. In one single day, James Puglia lost his parents and his brother forever. Christopher might still be alive. The brother James once knew is completely gone, replaced by someone who could unleash such horror in that house in Joyner. Our final case follows a man who planned to extend his deadly rampage, only to be stopped by car trouble. Corey Breen. On March 19, 2013, in Connie Vale, New South Wales, Corey Breen brutally attacked his father, Paul, and stepmother, Felicia Crawford, inside their home. Paul was 54, a father whose bond with his son had been broken for a very long time. Felicia was 43. Corey had harbored deep resentment toward them for years, and on that dark day he chose to unleash the violent fantasies building inside his mind. Corey viciously stabbed both Paul and Felicia multiple times. The strikes were ruthless and deliberate, ensuring that neither victim would survive. Once it was over, Corey walked out of the house, his hands covered in blood, eager to continue his deadly mission. His targets extended far beyond Paul and Felicia. Corey fully intended to drive to his mother's home to kill her and other relatives next. He carried a hit list of family members, but a sudden engine breakdown cut his murder spree short before he could reach them. Corey was 29 years old at the time. He grew up in a fractured home, enduring years of abuse from both his father and stepmother. That long-brewing hatred slowly festered, twisting from basic anger into dark, violent fantasies and finally exploding into real-world horror. He later called himself a ticking time bomb. Once his car broke down, Corey walked straight to the police and calmly confessed to the murders. He willingly walked detectives through the blood-spattered crime scene, explaining his actions and twisted motives in detail. Showing zero remorse, he detailed the horrific slayings as if he were simply describing an ordinary day. Corey laid bare his twisted mind in chillingly stark terms. The monster inside him had finally broken free. He confessed to years of harboring violent fantasies, believing these brutal acts were always inevitable. He viewed himself as a ticking time bomb, always ticking down toward this inevitable violent end. Ultimately, Corey was convicted of 2 counts of murder, receiving 42 years with a minimum of 33 years behind bars. That harsh sentence reflected not just the sheer brutality of his crimes, but clear evidence that he planned to strike again. The judge noted that only a sudden car breakdown had prevented further casualties. In November 25, Corey appealed his sentence, hoping for a reduction. His lawyers argued that a brutal childhood should have earned him a lighter punishment, but prosecutors hit back, arguing his cold-blooded plans and target list justified the heavy penalty. Today, Corey remains behind bars in New South Wales as his appeal works its way through the courts. Corey Breen's stepbrother, DN, saw part of the horror unfold and still lives with those nightmares today. A broken-down car was the only thing that stopped Corey's planned rampage, but the devastation he already caused shattered his family, leaving survivors with scars that may never heal. That sudden engine failure likely saved lives, as Corey's hit list included his own mother and other family members. Innocent people who surely would have died if his car had kept moving. A failing engine was the only barrier between Corey and more innocent victims. Paul Breen and Felicia Crawford paid the ultimate price for the dark rage that had built up inside Corey for years. Whether his deep resentment was real or just a twisted delusion, the tragic outcome was exactly the same. 2 people dead, and a family shattered by someone who was supposed to be part of it. That is all from us today. Thank you for watching.